welcome. Welcome back to the Policies for Better Lives conference. My name is Chris Barrington-Leigh. I'm the academic convener of the conference and a faculty member at the IHSP. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we're on today. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from which those of us in Montreal are joining today. And I'd like to recognize that any effort to conceive of new and better policy must also acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and that reconciliation and collaboration are up to each of us as well as all of us. So, welcome to the second week of our 4-week conference. Last week we had our opening panel. Hopefully through attending it or watching the recording, you all feel a little bit familiar with the evidence base behind the modern science of subjective well-being and how it is starting to be reflected in policy. By asking people how life feels overall, governments can build up knowledge about what really matters for a high quality of life, taking everything into account. Today, we are in one of 4 two-hour sessions, 2 of them running concurrently right now. And this one is about how policy might change lives for the better through the labor market or workplace regulation. So let me tell you one thing about the premise of today's session before I turn things over to our esteemed moderator. A tide has turned in the last few years amongst happiness researchers. And the change is that we're ready to move beyond research and beyond applying that research in our narrow circles and our own lives to what we call well-being policymaking and well-being budgeting. That means actually acting with public policy, changing what government does and where it spends our collective resources, all with an eye to making better lives. So the goal of today's session is to explore what policies we could really be putting into action now or in the near future and how good the evidence is for them. Et un mot pour nos participants francophones. Les conférenciers aujourd'hui feront leur présentation en anglais, mais vous êtes toujours également invités à poser des questions ou faire des commentaires en français. And it's now my great honor and pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session. Siobhan Harty is the Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet in the Privy Council office. And where she's been since October 2020, interesting times. In that role, she's responsible for supporting meetings of the cabinet, the government's overall policy agenda through the speech from the throne, and the development of policy advice and for new governments. As you can imagine, her accomplishments and influence prior to that position are extraordinary and numerous. I can't avoid mentioning that Siobhan is a McGill PhD graduate and a Montreal native. Siobhan has been a friend of the Institute for Health and Social Policy for a good decade, participating for many years on our advisory board. And as an ex-academic, I've read Siobhan say that, she is also an ex-academic, and I've read her say that academics don't have any clue how policy is actually made. And so that makes for a very exciting setup for the format of today's discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Siobhan.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this morning. And it's true, I did say that, and that is from personal experience, having been on both sides of things. So it's with great interest that I'm looking forward to the presentations and the discussion that's going to follow today. Let me start by telling you how we're going to organize things, and then I'll move on to some introductions. So this is a 2-hour session approximately, and the way we're going to organize it is by first sharing with you videos. So 2 videos from 2 researchers that I'll have the pleasure of introducing you to very quickly. And they're about 7-8 minutes each. I think all told we'll have about 20 minutes of their ideas related to evidence-based policies. After that, we will have 3 respondents who will provide their perspective on the ideas that were shared with us by the researchers. I will then moderate a question and answer session between the researchers and the respondents. And we'll keep it going. We'll see how it goes for about, 20 minutes or so. And then we would love to hear from the audience. And so Chris, I know will be sharing some questions with me in my private chat, and I'll be able to pull up some questions and we'll have an engagement with you. So just a little to do for you, put the questions in the Q&A, and then they will be taken care of by Chris, who will be able to send them on to me. So let me start by introducing our two researchers, and you'll get to see them a little later on. We're all on, we've turned our cameras off to save bandwidth. The first of the presentations that you'll see on video is from Ferrer-i-Carbonell. She's the scientist at the Institute for Economic Analysis and the director of the graduate student master program in economics of public policy at the University of Barcelona. Her main research interests are the analysis of subjective well-being through subjective questions and its applications to key economic outcomes, such as health, inequality, and other public policies. Our second researcher is Anke Plagnol, who is Associate Professor and Program Director in Behavioural Economics at the City University of London. And Dr. Plagnol is interested in the choices that individuals make and how these affect their subjective well-being. For instance, how couples' division of paid and unpaid work, including mental load, is associated with individual well-being. And you're going to hear about that in her video. After we hear the two videos, we'll move on to our respondents, and we have three. The first one up will be Armine Yalnizyan, who's well known to many of us in Canada. She's an economist and Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers, but she has worked most recently as a special advisor to employment and social development for the Deputy Minister. And she's also currently serving on a task group on women in the economy that was set up by the Minister of Finance and the Associate Minister of Finance. Our second respondent is Bernie Miller, who is currently Deputy Minister in the Office of the Strategy of Management in the Government of Nova Scotia. And that's not the first Deputy Minister position Bernie's had. He's held several over the years. And prior to joining the public service in Nova Scotia, he was a leader in the private sector for 26 years, including a managing partner and CEO of McInnes Cooper. And if that's not all, he's also done and continues to do a lot of work in the community in terms of working on boards and advisory capacity. And I think it reflects his commitment to happiness and well-being. And last but not least, Don Drummond, who's also well known in Canadian circles in terms of his contributions across many sectors. So currently as Matthews Fellow and Visiting Scholar at the School of Public Policy at Policy Studies at Queen's, but of course his career spans the public service, where he held a number of positions at the Department of Finance over 20 plus years, and in the private sector, where he was Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for the TD Bank. So we will now turn to the videos. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having invited me and to give me this opportunity to present my ideas in this very interesting setting. My name is Ferrer-i-Carbonell, and I have been working on life satisfaction, happiness, and well-being for about 22 years now. Many of us in the field of happiness have over the years thought about public policies as instruments to enhance well-being. There are actually many public policies that could be implemented. Many of those policies, however, are long-term projects, which means that one reaps the benefits much later. There are policies, however, that are pressing, and its implementation can lead to fairly immediate positive results. I think that the proposal I defend today here falls into this last category, and COVID-19 has accelerated its need. I would like to support a policy proposal that I think will make a substantial difference in terms of well-being for an important part of the population. Namely, I think that the government should contribute to establish the mechanisms that would allow underrepresented workers to coordinate and have negotiating power, notably via collective bargaining. Underrepresented workers include a fairly broad range of workers, and its categorization is difficult and can slightly depend on the country. I will go more into detail later, but have in mind that when I say underrepresented, I refer to workers as different as gig workers, casual workers, or self-employed. Not only in Canada, almost everywhere in the Western world, there is a substantial and increasing amount of workers that are underrepresented in the policy arena. And I would like to advocate not necessarily for the design of specific policies directed to these workers, but rather for a policy that wants to empower them so as to balance the power of the different actors in the economy. Through coordination, these workers can advocate themselves for designing labor, tax, and social policies that seek to maximize their welfare, and not only the welfare of those that are represented. Some of these workers may, others may not, face legal constraints to unionize, but they all share in common a coordination problem that hampers their capacity to negotiate with policymakers. I understand that Canada has taken some important initiatives, for example, the Freelance Union, and I also know that the Minister of Labour is meeting with employers and unions, as well as with groups representing those working through digital platforms. But going further would set Canada as an example, and this would have an important impact. In these processes, one needs to think about including and distinguishing very different types of underrepresented workers. For example, one might think of gig workers. Those are, of course, the largest chunk of workers we have in mind when we think about underrepresented workers. Those already existed and include traditional causal employment, such as temporary workers or those working through temporary work agencies. But it also includes those that work through digital platforms, such as Amazon riders or Uber drivers that have increased in quantity in the recent years. Some of those gig workers include more creative jobs, such as working for Google. Another set, very different type of workers that are underrepresented are the self-employed workers, or also employers of very small business, owners of very small business. Have in mind 1 to 4 people business, small restaurants, etc., for which working for themselves is typically linked to a larger satisfaction with their life and their work. Outside of the scope of this policy that I'm recommending, one could even think about another portion of the population, which are the unemployed and the young people, which are often also underrepresented. But this is a much more complex problem that I will not touch upon today. As I said at the beginning, this is about giving voice in a structured manner by helping establishing the mechanisms through which workers in non-traditional type of contracts can coordinate and negotiate. It's thus about balancing power. Policymakers face many trade-offs. In this context, for example, they need to protect labor while not destroying jobs. Gig workers face poor working conditions, and through these negotiating mechanisms, this type of workers can obtain labor protection, health and safety regulations, minimum wage, sick leaves, etc. But policymakers also have to protect consumers. Consumer choice is important, and choice is good for consumers' well-being. The gig economy, for example, might have lower prices or offer more variety of products or longer opening times. Choice, however, is also being able to shop in the small bookstore, and this is only maintained if small businesses do not get eaten up by unfair competition. And that's why I argue that a well-being enhancing policy is about balancing power, so that if the gig economy expands and puts out of the market a small business, this is the outcome of a negotiation in which all agents are well represented. Policymakers, of course, also face fierce competition to attract large business other than those operating through digital platforms who typically employ gig workers. They also, policymakers, have to attract companies investing in R&D that offer good jobs and help maintaining production in key sectors to avoid, for example, the supply shortage of vaccines. Policymakers, as I say, face a lot of trade-offs. And that's why it's important that the policies to design mechanisms to help different types of workers to be well represented, rather than to decide what is good for them. The aim of this policy is to increase workers' well-being, which is not only a goal in itself, but it also has positive effects to the general population. Happy workers are more productive and contribute to a more stable society and to sustained growth. Sustained and stable growth, even if smaller, is preferred in terms of well-being to strong business cycles, as recessions with high unemployment and poverty rates are very damaging for well-being. Although these issues have all been very relevant over the last decade, COVID-19, as I said at the beginning, has accelerated the process in a tremendous and unprecedented way. Gig workers have increased their share over the last year, and the numbers have only increased after the outbreak of the pandemic. Self-employed and small business, which also represent a large percentage of the Canadian economy, are struggling with COVID restrictions. Why do I think that this policy would have an impact on happiness and well-being? It is true that gig workers, and in general temporary and casual workers, allow flexibility and offer jobs to people that have difficult access to a regular labor market, such as young people, long-term unemployed, low-educated, students, etc. Nevertheless, there are also many aspects of the jobs of the gig workers that might make them very vulnerable in terms of satisfaction and happiness. And it's those aspects that can be negotiated into collective bargaining. The literature has shown that individuals' happiness and life satisfaction depends to a large extent to having a good job. But a good job means many things that gig workers may not have access to. It's not only a high income per se, but it's also certainty and stable income. The current working conditions, health, safety at work, autonomy, access to unemployment benefits, etc., have also shown to impact positively happiness. And gig workers are lacking some of them, as well as they lack training at work and they have no promotion possibility. I talk about certainty of income, but certainty is not only important in monetary terms, but also in working time. Flexible working can be desired in some circumstances, but stable working times allow to balance work life and work family and work social life much better. Social capital and close relationships are key to individuals' happiness, and individuals in stable working times can more easily foster social relationships. Social capital is not only relevant for individuals' happiness. Countries with high levels of social capital, trust, and shared norms are also more cohesive and function better. Some individuals may choose to work in the gig economy, but there are many as well who do that because they have little access to stable jobs. And my proposal here is that they are able to coordinate and negotiate so all those aspects I mentioned that may be well-being damaging can be negotiated in a table with a policymaker. In contrast, however, self-employment or individuals working in very small firms enjoy autonomy and typically have jobs that are closer to their interests and education. And here, therefore, I distinguish what I would call true self-employment from gig casual employment. Self-employed are, to me, those individuals that have small jobs that they work for themselves because they want to work in things closely related to their studies, closely related to their interests, and they like job autonomy, which is a key determinant for job satisfaction and well-being. The expansion of the gig economy might force a small business to close or self-employment to go to unemployed. This would reduce well-being of society. Of course, there are also very creative and autonomous jobs in large companies. This is just a small picture of what I'm trying to do here. Being unemployed is actually one of the worst things that can happen to an individual in terms of economic terms, of course. There are personal things that can be worse than unemployed. And young and unemployed individuals are also overrepresented. Among many policy proposals, to me, when I was thinking about this seems to be one of the most effective in order to increase the life satisfaction and well-being of a growing part of the population. There are other policies that are aligned with the ones I propose here, but would require longer-term investment. Investments in education, regulating the life-work balance, get incentives to create a startup of small business. Those are policies totally aligned with what I'm saying, but require longer-term investments and are more costly. Instead, fostering and establishing the mechanisms to allow an increasing significant part of the workforce to coordinate and increase their negotiation power is less costly than many other social policies, while the outcomes of such negotiations are bound to have an important effect on well-being and happiness. Although of a much smaller size, the impact that this would have can be thought in terms of all rights gained by the labor movements at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, such as the 9 hours working day. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Anke Plagnol. Many thanks for inviting me to talk about subjective well-being in the labor market. The issue that I want to talk about today concerns gender inequalities in the labor market. As you're probably aware, in many countries we observe employment rates that are lower for women than for men. Women are often underrepresented in higher level positions, and in many industries we can observe a significant gender pay gap. Now, there are many reasons for these observations, and most of these reasons are related to labor market withdrawal and lack of career progression. So, for example, we can look at gender norms. And I should say that actually the reasons I'm presenting here, this is a very partial list. There are many more, but I'm just mentioning some of the research that I have conducted in the area. So, for example, we can look at gender norms. So husbands often tend to out-earn their wives, and therefore it often makes sense for couples that the woman stays home after childbirth if she earns indeed less. But what I looked at with one of my colleagues, Vanessa Gash, is whether there's also psychological premium of having a partner pay gap where one partner makes more money than the other. And indeed, we saw that in some circumstances there is a psychological premium for men, but not necessarily for women. Now, we can also look at job satisfaction. So there is this assumption that women may select into work. Indeed, for example, Andrew Clark has observed that women tend to report higher levels of job satisfaction than men. So some people argue that maybe they select into work. So that means that they might have the option to opt out of the labor force if they don't like their jobs. And indeed, that's something we observed might be true for women in low-quality jobs after childbirth. In another study, we considered whether job satisfaction before childbirth is related to when women return to work. And indeed, we could see that in the UK, at least, women with low levels of job satisfaction before giving birth tend to return to work later than women who really enjoyed their jobs before giving birth. So this might already be an option for policies that maybe policies that improve women's job satisfaction might make them stay in the labor market after childbirth. Now, many studies have looked at the challenges that women face of combining work and other responsibilities, such as unpaid work. So this could relate to childcare responsibilities, other caring responsibilities, and household tasks. In some recent research with some of my colleagues, we looked at the mental load. Now, this relates to household management tasks. So, for example, who organizes birthday parties? Who thinks about whether the children need new clothes or organizes what needs to be ready for school the next day? So these cognitive tasks, or also called the mental load, are also unpaid work tasks, which are often done by women. And as this is often invisible work, it tends to be neglected and shouldered disproportionately by women. In our studies, we looked at whether the division of the mental load may be improved during the pandemic, and we saw while men and women both tended on average to do more unpaid work than before the pandemic, the division of labor did not necessarily change. Now, another thing I want to briefly address here is the long work hours culture that we observe in many countries. So this is related to the ideal worker culture where work is prioritized. So good workers are workers that spend many hours at work. Long work hours basically signal commitment and performance. Now, engaging in a long work hours culture can be very difficult for people with caring responsibilities because they simply cannot stay very long at work. So this, again, might disproportionately affect women with caring responsibilities. And of course, there are many, many other reasons why women might not progress in the labor market or remain in the labor market. So again, this was just a very partial list. However, let's have a look at policy challenges. So could we actually devise policies that change any of this? Some of the reasons that I mentioned are related to norms. For example, the long work hour culture norms or gender norms. Can we change these through policies? Well, not directly, but policies can change behavior. And once behavior changes, then norms might also slowly change over time. It's also important to make sure that any policy solutions we propose do not focus just on women, because that may actually marginalize them. So for example, when we say that people with caring responsibility, maybe mainly women, have the right to work from home, this will just marginalize them and might then make it less likely for women to be seen as ideal workers, as desirable employees. We also need to consider unintended consequences. So for example, now during the pandemic, many people started working from home. So should we implement a right to work from home? This might be a very good idea, but an unintended consequence could be that then people would engage in even more unpaid work than beforehand, because now they're constantly at home. And indeed, it has been observed that unpaid work increased during the pandemic for people working from home. So the policy proposal I want to focus on then is that of working time reduction. And you often see this in the press or policy proposals referred to as the 4-day week. So here the idea is to shorten the work hours of full-time employees without a reduction in pay. So that's quite important, that there's not a reduction in pay. And the assumption here is that people do the same amount of work, but in less time. So instead of defining full-time as being usually 36 to 40 hours, full-time is then being defined as being 30 to 32 hours. So what is important here is that it's available to all employees, not just based on caring responsibilities, for example, because again, that might marginalize some workers. And there are some very fantastic reports, for example, by my colleague Hee-Jung Chung, which I would encourage you to have a look at. So what are the benefits of policy like this? Well, this should lead to a better balance between work and non-work activities. It might also change how we value work and leisure. And there are many well-being benefits. People have more time to spend on what makes them happy. There's a longer weekend. So it should increase satisfaction with work-life balance, life satisfaction overall, possibly also job satisfaction, because people will have more time for rest and maybe then have more energy and focus for their paid work. Could also improve relationship satisfaction because people can spend more time with their families, again, might be less stressed, so bring less stress from the work to the home life. So it might quite hopefully lead to improvement over mental health. Then policies like that could eliminate social inequalities, including gender inequality. Also, these are not brand new proposals. There are companies that have implemented 4-day work weeks, and they often report an improvement in productivity and also creativity, perhaps because employees get more rest. We can also think about improvements in children's outcomes, because now they're spending more time with their parents. And what some companies have already reported is a reduction in absenteeism, turnover intentions, and levels of burnout among their employees. So now I want to quickly thank my many collaborators that have worked on research related to this and other topics with me. And thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Many thanks to Ada and Anke for developing and sharing those ideas with us. And so now we're going to move on to the respondents and to get their views on those two proposals. So Armine, you are up first, and we very much look forward to it. I'll just come in after about 5 minutes if you're still talking, and give you a little signal. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this session and to tune in to what these two brilliant researchers had to offer us. Of course, jobs are what make for more people. And any job can be a good job, but don't forget that even the goal of full employment, as Jesse Jackson used to say, is we had full employment with slavery. So good jobs are the key to happier people, as has been reinforced. And it's interesting to me that both these presentations is about time. Of course, time is money. but we're talking both about shortening longer hours and improving the purchasing power of shorter hours. It reminds me a little bit of the work I did when I was asked by the then Minister of Human Resources and Social Development, Lloyd Axworthy, to sit on a task force on shortening working time in 1993. Around the world, we were dealing with a very long, protracted period of high unemployment rates, and shortening and redistributing working time was becoming quite a common response to at least discuss for governments. Of course, we didn't do anything about it. We cut unemployment insurance instead, but that's a different story. So the point that Ada brought up right at the beginning is that a shift in the balance of power is what's needed. We have had 40 years of a labor surplus that we have been coping with. And we are moving now, interestingly, into, I think, a protracted period of about 25 to 30 years of labor shortages throughout the global north. So there's already an organic shift in bargaining power taking place because of demographics throughout the global north. But this is exactly what Christine Lagarde and the ECB and the World Bank and the IMF were talking about since 2010. What is the definition of inclusive growth? It includes a fundamental shift in bargaining power. So Ada's suggestion of sectoral bargaining for low-paid workers and her focus on gig workers is really interesting to me. In the wake of all recessions, you see a spike in the demand for on-demand work. We have not seen it yet in Canada, maybe because we don't measure gig work well here or actually anywhere. But if organizing workers is any measure, there has been more pushback by gig workers themselves. In Canada, we have the formation of Gig Workers Unite. And there were also unions supporting gig workers such as Uber and Lyft drivers around the world in the UK, the US, and in Europe that helped bankroll court cases that went all the way up to the Supreme Courts and challenged the classification of these workers as self-employed, which meant that they could not receive any labor protections. And we're now starting to see the same thing in Canada. We did get up to the Supreme Court in Canada on this. We are going to have a fight on our hands about the classification. But given that misclassification takes place in employment standards, and employment, we have 14 different jurisdictions that have their own labor codes. Sectoral bargaining sounds like a real sweet deal. Examples already exist, and in fact, New Zealand just introduced fair pay legislation, which is a form of sectoral bargaining, I think about a week ago, certainly in April, just at the end of April. But the very first fair pay legislation in Canada happened in Toronto in 1893 in the construction sector. It still exists, and it's still probably the strongest such legislation in Canada that helps undermine undercutting in the industry so that there's no bottom to low wages. And we have seen sectoral bargaining work for workers in film and stage. That's another example through IHSP. The last comment I will make with regard to sectoral bargaining is against this idea of growing bargaining power is the fact that because of population aging and widespread labor shortages, we are going to see a growth in newcomers. Newcomers come in two flavors, temporary and permanent residents. And we have seen 2.5 temporary residents admitted for every permanent resident in the last few years, and these workers have notoriously very little bargaining power. So immigration policies are going to have to row in the same direction as whatever we're talking about in terms of bargaining power, or sheer numbers will eclipse the ability of new workers to actually exercise any kind of strength in the labor market. I want to now turn to the shorter working hours position of Anke. And when I was on Axworthy's advisory group, we also were talking about this very thing. In fact, France proposed in 1992 to reduce maximum working hours to a 4-day week, 32 hours from 39 hours. In 1993, Volkswagen in Germany reduced the working day to a 4-day week to be able to redistribute work. France didn't actually reduce working time till 2000, and they reduced the workday, the official workday before which you have to pay overtime, from 39 to 35 hours. But in Canada, we haven't seen any major changes in the hours of work since the Second World War. Tighter labor markets, though, are going to bring this about, I think, because of population aging again. When you have 1 in 4 of your population with living on lower incomes than when they were working and fixed, they don't want to see any wage push. So one of the ways you can actually improve the quality of working life for workers is fewer hours for the same pay. But I don't think it's going to show up in the form of 4-day work weeks. Tighter labor markets are going to mean more demand for longer leaves, and we're already seeing it with paid sick leave and more care leaves for people who have got family members who are too young, too old, or too sick to work. We're going to see more demands for training leave. We're going to see possibly more statutory holidays, earlier retirements, phased retirements. All of this was in the 1994 report that we produced for Axworthy. So I think a 4-day work week might not be the ticket, but a shorter work year or work life might be the ticket. And that will be pressured by this shrinking cohort of the working age that needs to prop up everybody else, and will not be permitted to see large wage increases, I don't think, or there will be some kind of pressure backlash against it. I want to say that Quebec is the leader. We have been discussing supplementary benefits for those who are not EI eligible for parental leaves for quite some time now with the current administration. And the 2017 federal budget actually introduced a parental leave for EI eligible parents, modeled somewhat after Quebec, which is a use it or lose it phenomenon. In 2006, Quebec introduced their own parental insurance plan. They divorced themselves from the EI plan, and they included higher replacement rates for new parents, up to 52 weeks, and critically, 5 weeks of use it or lose it leave for the second parent, which is often the father. And the take-up rates amongst new dads, jumped by 250%, and now 80% of new fathers in Quebec take that parental leave. That's a model that we can again be following. And the reason I think we're going down that route is because the pandemic actually poured accelerant on all these stories and revealed that the care economy is the foundation of the essential economy. And that includes both paid work in care as well as unpaid care.
Armine, we're going to have to wrap up.
With a shrinking working age cohort, we are going to see shifting bargaining power. And I think that speaks to both presenters' ideas. Thanks very much.
Thank you. No, that's great. And that's going to be stimulating when we get to the interaction with the panelists. Bernie, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I congratulate both researchers to get us thinking about how these policy ideas connect to well-being. And they certainly accomplished that in my case. I'm going to address them in turn, first with the reduced work hours or the longer work hours culture is how I'm going to put it, and address 3 points on that, and then come to the other issue of organizing underrepresented workers using a collective bargaining model. This in the context of how do these policy ideas translate into better lives and happiness and well-being really got me thinking. And obviously we're dealing with uncertainty in the future, so take everything I say with an appropriate grain of many salts. But as a policymaker, I'm trying to translate how these really interesting ideas would work in practice. So with the long work hours culture, I'll share a very brief story. I was, as was mentioned in the opening, I was the managing partner of a law firm. And I took on that role in 2006. And the predecessor managing partner had, I think, a good vision of the future, and had thought that a good way to recruit the best and the brightest to our firm would be a different approach for law firms at the time. The slogan was, put life on your to-do list. And the idea was, unlike other ultra-competitive, glorifying long work hour culture environments, was different. You could have a balanced life. Well, that went over like a lead balloon with the partners of the law firm. And that wasn't the only reason I became managing partner, but I came in shortly after that. And this was, I guess, a beginning of a time of reflection on these types of questions. And the presentation was very well put together, put in the context of gender inequalities, and obviously, maybe not so obviously, but in the legal profession, accounting professions, there were and are significant gender inequalities rooted in this concept of long work hour culture. So I think this is a very timely and exciting policy proposal, context of life satisfaction. And to the point that was just made about the changing dynamics of the workforce, having people select into the labor market and having higher levels of productivity connected to life satisfaction are concepts that need further exploration, and I think are real opportunities as we kind of shift from the economy we're in now to a future economy with a different labor makeup. So on this one, selecting in and the productivity benefits certainly stood out to me as really important concepts. I'll just kind of summarize by saying I really think this is a timely idea, and the concept of changing norms is certainly, I think, more effective than going to simply a legislative solution and regulating work hours. So the idea of changing norms then leads to the question, how do you do that? Where to start? And it strikes me that both the public sector and the community sector are the places where employers can take the lead in changing these norms. And inevitably, the private sector will follow. And the reason I say that is back in 2005, put life on your to-do list was certainly heretical for a law firm. But today, this is the way you would attract and keep talent for sure. So the time has come. And I think if in a diminishing workforce where there's going to be more competition for talent, if you have the public sector and the community sector adopting these norms, and importantly, as Anke pointed out, that this isn't less pay, this is the same pay for fewer hours, the private sector would inevitably have to follow because the market would require them to do that. So I think it's an exciting policy proposal, and it's one that is definitely connected to life satisfaction and well-being and worthy of further analysis. On the proposal about the challenge and opportunities associated with the gig economy and independent workers, I certainly think that there is a foundational opportunity and a challenge that needs to be addressed. I think I would say on this one, I diverge from the presentation in a couple of ways. One, I'd regard it as an industrial age solution to a digital age challenge. And I'd go further back in history to beyond the beginning of the industrial age, and maybe we've got glorified views of the pre-industrial age, but at a time of artisans and guilds, although to economists, guilds are probably a bad word, but the idea of having a model that's distinct and different from the collective bargaining model of the industrial age may be something to consider. One of the things I'd be interested in knowing is there data and analysis of what independent workers actually want? In the presentation, there was, I think, a well-articulated position around certainty, predictability, stable income. But I'd want to know more data about whether people are trading off certainty for flexibility when they select into these types of roles. And I'd also be interested in examining, what are the alternatives to collective bargaining? The model that I was hearing in that presentation was essentially what we would call the Wagner Act model, where in order to equalize bargaining power, you use statutory frameworks in order to level the playing field between employer and employee. in practice, I've seen that in both the private sector and the public sector. And when I connect the concept to life satisfaction and happiness, I'd offer this kind of general view. If we assume that the outcome of collective bargaining and negotiation will increase life satisfaction, I think I would personally want to be challenging that model. Because the collective bargaining model of the Wagner Act, in my experience, has always been that the leadership of the sector, the unit, the union, as it may be, needs their membership to be moderately dissatisfied at all times, and that may be cynicism of age. But I've certainly been involved since I've been in the public sector in many aspects of the collective bargaining environment. And I've seen happy people become unhappy because they need to be organized in order to get a sufficient level of bargaining power with the employer. So I raised those questions, but I thought both were great presentations.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Bernie. Don.
Well, thank you. As an economist, I'll start off by noting much of economics is based on the notion that when things go badly, it's usually from lack of information, and they especially go badly when there's an asymmetry of the information available to both parties. So in accepting this as my bad, I did not realize that this was an exercise of proposing a single element of policy to change a deep and serious and important policy problem. And the people who asked me participated clearly were not aware that when put in such a position, I tend to play very, very badly. And the reason I do is that there's a problem that's been so serious and so ingrained that it's come to our attention in this fashion. It requires multiple approaches. And above all, and I suppose coming back to that comment that people in some segments may not understand, how public policy is, or at least should be informed, the number one aspect is you don't get anywhere unless you understand and you fundamentally change an underlying culture and practices. So if we take the labor market, and particularly the proposal of fewer hours, the number one thing that is needed is greater flexibility. And just changing the number of hours that we work is keeping us in a straitjacket. It may have a little bit more room, but it's still a straitjacket. We know that older workers want to continue to work in some fashion, but they don't necessarily want to work in exactly the same fashion they just did for the last 35 years. They want flexible arrangements, and cutting it to 4 days a week instead of 5 scratches a little bit of that itch, but not very far. We need to get into the particular practice. I know people on this are academics. The law practice was raised. Look at the life cycle pattern of that and throw in an accountant's. Your career prospects, whether you're on tenure in a university or whether you're on track to be a partner, is determined almost uniquely by your work between the ages of 25 and 35. That totally denies the reality of biology. It's totally unfair to women. That has to be changed. It can be changed. We need to get on to aspects like this. I want to get at the culture. I'm going to use one example because in anything, the quality of life, health will dominate. And just look at, we are in the midst of a transformation in the medical profession that will be absolutely phenomenal, but we're not quite there yet. So if you went into a medical school 20 years ago, you would see almost all men, very few women. Go in today, you'll see exactly the opposite. It is dominated by women. So the supply side is shifted, but they don't have the practices that they want. And I emphasize this is not so much what female medical students or recent graduates want. It is shared by the men as well. They don't want to work alone, operating a small business, be encumbered by an administrative burden. They want more of a salary employment type of arrangement. They want retirement benefits. They want sick leave if they need it. They want to have maternity leave if and when they need it. They want to collaborate with colleagues. They don't want to do something where they don't have a comparative advantage simply because it's going to make them money. Why don't they get that? We're slowly moving that direction, but ever so slowly. And we do have unions there, and the unions haven't delivered what they wanted. And in fact, we're again in negotiation in Ontario with the Ontario Medical Association, which in fact is a union. They don't like to think about it that way. And they're basically asking just to keep everything the way it was before, but increase it by 5%. So the younger physicians have got to get in and have more of an influence, and timing is everything in public policy. The timing is absolutely right. We're moving across Canada, the establishment of clinic-based healthcare. We're moving in Ontario to Ontario health teams. that speaks to that prospect, we can make much greater progress. This is so much bigger, and the potential and the need so much greater than just changing the number of hours we work. In terms of workers who are underpaid and have very poor working conditions, yes, unionize, and on average unions can raise 17%, but again, it's a culture. We have a culture, we have not valued these workers. The pandemic brought to the attention of it. You know, we've always known we have 1/3 fewer long-term care workers than the OECD average, but we didn't really care, we didn't see the results. Now we get it. Now we're starting to appreciate this a little more, but we're stuck in two historical practices. We seem to think there has to be a hierarchy in wages. Those who are well educated, the only people who get paid well. Well, forget that notion. If you have difficulty hiring certain people and you need to value them more, you're going to pay them more. And that will raise the wages and draw more people into it. We're seeing them, we get it on long-term care, and they've been increasing the wages, but all that's been happening so far is that siphoning off work from home care. The whole attitude needs to be changed. And in many respects, quite often the market works against establishing fairness, but in this time, we just need to let the market work. We're having demand-supply imbalances for many of the workers who are paid little wages, and there's a huge resistance to increase their wages. They can't be making more than bachelor's or college graduates. Forget that notion. If it's valuable work and we need the workers, let that pay rise. And if that means we pay more for long-term care, yeah, that's what we're going to have to do because it's a valuable service and health is the number one priority. I will end there.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, you were right on time there. Thanks, Don. So thanks to our three respondents. And I'm going to circle back now to our two researchers, and give them a chance to respond. So lots of comments there. But Ada, maybe we could ask you first to just give us some initial reactions. So I was struck by Bernie's comment that, perhaps you are proposing an industrial age solution age challenge. I don't know if that's fair, but there was some questions raised in terms of, do we have the right instrument? What is the data telling us? Are the trade-offs the right ones in terms of how people select into those sectors? So let's start with your reactions to that, and then we'll turn to Anke. And Anke, I think, some really good comments from all three respondents, but I'm sort of struck by what Don said at the end. It's a question of flexibility, and I'm sure that you appreciate that, not just hours. It's about changing culture. So would love to hear your initial reactions to that. So Ada, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'll try to be brief so there is more opportunity for everybody. So thank you for all the comments. It's amazing, and I really took notes of everything for my future research, even if I don't comment on everything. I hope I was not proposing, it's funny that Werner was mentioning that I propose an industrialization solution, because I am not always in favor of unions. So it's a kind of a strange thing that he said about me, but I understand why he says, because I mentioned the word collective bargaining. I mean, it doesn't have to be collective bargaining necessarily. So there are many changes that have to do in the way that the unions work, or in the way that we're bargaining in the sectors. But what seems to me clear is that at this moment there is an unbalanced power. And while some sectors are well represented in collective bargaining and other types of negotiation, others are not. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it has to be collective bargaining per se, this type of a structure. In any case, it's clear to me, not to everybody, I understand, that that there is a way that we should try to balance the powers, and that some sectors are clearly well unionized and they participate in collective bargaining. So that was my point. Maybe we can modify it and do it through other systems. That I wouldn't have any problem. On the self-selection, that's a whole issue, right? So, but that's the problem always of selecting yourself or not selecting yourself. There is demand selection and supply selection. And what it's clear is that there are individuals that love autonomy, are creative, like occupations that tend to be so they have occupations that are more related to having independent jobs, self-employment, small businesses. Those are happy people. They may have uncertainty in their income. They might have flexible hours, but that's a choice they make. They are people usually more equipped to deal with risk They are not so risk averse as other people that will be public servants, for example, and that's okay. We have to have all jobs, right? My issue here is with those individuals that are not selecting themselves into that sector, but these are individuals that they cannot find a job anywhere else, right? So we are talking about marginalized jobs. We are talking about people that don't have access to other types of jobs because of education, because of nationality, because of many other things, right? So I think I would like to distinguish these two, and that's what I was trying to make clear in the video. And self-selection can also come from the demand side. So there are workers that cannot have jobs that they would like to have. In relation to very shortly also on the market regulation and whether we should be regulating the market or let wages be decided by the market, great, let wages be decided by the market, but then let all wages be decided by the market. So it's clear that we are regulating certain, I am in favor of a bit of regulation. I am a social democrat in the spirit, but still, if we all agree together that as a society that we should not regulate any part of the economy, then we shouldn't regulate any. We have sectors that over-regulated with collective bargaining, etc., where others not. And that's what I meant when I said an unfair competition. I also don't want to take a paternalistic position, and that's why I was saying, I don't know what's good for them. I don't know what people are looking in the gig economy. I'm just saying, let's give the instruments, let's help them to organize. Bernard was talking about people feeling miserable because they have to organize so much work. Imagine if you are not allocated in the same company. Imagine if you have flexible work times, if you don't even have the nationality or don't speak well the language. That's even harder to organize yourself. Although I do know, thank you, Armine, as well, that there have been court cases. So I do know they have some capacity to organize. But I think that sometimes there is also, it's very important if these people get some help on organizing themselves. Maybe they will also reach more workers because they may not be, the people that go to fight the court cases may not be representing all the gig economy workers because we know that some of them are not being able to be reached. So I just, I think more. I mean, I can talk longer. I don't know.
Oh, we can. Let's go to Anke, and then we can have some back and forth, which I think the audience will really enjoy. Sure. Anke, what are your initial reactions to the comments from the respondents?
Yes, so thank you very much. Very nice comments. And I actually agree very much with Don, what he says about there has to be flexibility and more solutions, and just working time reduction itself is not enough for many people. Yes, I actually absolutely agree with that. However, with cultural changes, I think we often have to start with the policy approach as a bit, well, a force and change in working behavior. Like Armine actually mentioned, when you have a take it or leave it provision in parental leave, then we see in the beginning, if it's not a take it or leave it provision, people don't take it up. But if it becomes a take it or leave it provision, then fathers also pick it up. And then over time, it becomes slowly a norm where fathers will all take leave. So flexibility, of course, is another important thing we need to look at. And actually, when Chris set us this challenge of coming up with one proposal, first I wanted to say, okay, I want to talk about the right to work from home, which now for many of us has become really normal to work from home. But then I discussed it with some of my collaborators, and we had quite a few discussions about it. And one problem that can occur there is that when you use right to work from home, which is, well, one of the flexibility options you might have been thinking about, that often it leads to more of a blurring between home and work life. And then people actually still work really long hours because work never leaves them. They're always at home, always in their office, so to speak. And they just do more of everything, of paid work and unpaid work. So then I thought that the working time reduction proposal is something that gets more at the point where we can maybe achieve more equality for marginalized group and, well, gender equality, which I'm focusing on here, because it will just allow both men and women to engage more in a feasible manner in work life and be seen as a good employee and be promoted and so on. But I absolutely agree with you that flexibility is also very important. However, with flexibility, there can be unintended consequences. Personally, I'm a big fan of working from home, and I think it is very important for people with caring responsibility, allows many mothers and fathers to stay in the workforce, but it needs to be implemented very sensibly, that it doesn't end up in a way that then everyone just works way past normal work hours and works on weekends because their office is now in the home. So yeah, shall I wrap up here and we discuss?
Yeah, thank you. No, that's great. So I'm going to open it up, and I'm just going to remind participants to put their questions in the Q&A and not the chat, and Chris will funnel them to me. But I'm going to start by turning back to Armine. So Armine, you've looked at this pandemic situation and characterized it as a she session that we're going through now. You're obviously doing some work now on women in the economy. I'd love it if you could bring a bit of a gendered perspective to some of what we heard, especially from Anke, especially her last remarks, about some of the flexibilities, but also her warnings about marginalization, and what your thoughts are there.
Well, I don't think you can separate out what I said earlier about how do you achieve the biggest gains in terms of a reduction in working hours, which we haven't seen in 70 years in this country. If that is a possibility, that increased productivity does give you a little bit more leisure from a system point of view, who gets access to that leisure and who has to scramble for whatever jobs they can get, and who gets to, to Dawn's point of flexibility. If you want to work longer, great, but a lot of people don't have the option, whether they can work longer or not, because they have to cobble together a number of jobs to be able to make ends meet. So I think there is something that is coming down the pike because of population aging that will permit workers to increase their bargaining power organically because of widespread labor and skill shortages across all skills and every region. This will not be just big city or depopulating small town based. And so consequently, I think we need to be thinking about what are the mechanisms for reducing the number of paid hours while you still are not seeing a reduction in pay, which was the essential starting point for Anke's suggestion of a 4-day work week with less pay. I just don't think that the 4-day work week is going to work in many places. And with respect, only 31% of people right now can work from home in Canada, or are working from home in Canada. At the peak, when everything was shut down, it was 41%. The majority of work takes place in a place. And the pandemic revealed that there's a limitation to who can work at home and who needs to be in people-facing businesses. So the solution isn't just more work from home. It will not reach enough people. And the gendered part of the she session is also highly interwoven with low pay, and low pay is always interwoven with racialized minorities, just systemically marginalized populations, recent immigrants, young people, racialized minorities, indigenous populations, disabled, like all the groups that now have an opportunity to be brought into the mainstream, to actually get opportunities to be more upskilled and have better jobs and more stable jobs. That is what population aging is putting in front of us as, that's what's in the window right now. But we may actually snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory if we treat labor shortages and skill shortages the way we've done in the last generation, which is let's import the solution. And that may mean that we reduce the bargaining power that our own residents have at this moment. I think that's a really interesting issue, and it's as important from a gendered point of view as from all the other intersectional groups that are systemically marginalized in the labor markets. So I think making it gendered is hugely important, but the she session is, the only thing the she session showed us that is gendered is that care matters, and that women do more unpaid care than men do, and that we are going to need a lot more care going down in future, and that tighter between paid and unpaid care and who does it is going to be a really lively policy discussion for the coming decade, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to open it up and see if Dawn or Bernie wanted to come in and say anything.
I'll go. I guess while I'm balking at the notion of a single recommendation, maybe I'll dip into that a little bit and say, well, maybe we funnel all this into one idea, but a different and a broader one. The labor market has to be much more flexible and has many, many different dimensions of that. You know, we kind of have a very straitjacket approach. You work and you might start at 22 and you work flat out until you're 60 or 62 or whatever it is, and then you completely retire. And that doesn't work very well for people. As I said, a whole bunch of professions, accounting, law, academia, load up the all your career prospects into that 24 to 35 inch. That doesn't work. You have to change that life cycle. There has to be flexible part-time arrangements for older workers. There's no reason why your whole workforce has to be doing exactly the same thing at the same time. And there's no reason why everybody has to be in the office. We've demonstrated over the last year, you can have some of your workforce, maybe always, maybe part of the time at home. We can be a lot more flexible than we are right now. And as Armine says, the time is right to do that, because I don't think we will or do have a generalized labor shortage, but we've definitely got labor demand and supply mismatching, and employers and society have to accept that we can fill those gaps so we're more flexible. Every once in a while, give people what they want and everybody be better off. And it's not just the particular two suggestions, but it is a rewrite really across all the labor market practices.
No, thanks for that. Bernie, any comment?
Yeah, the implicit in a lot of the conversation is the working for wages, and obviously the wage and the importance of a good wage. And I don't want to diminish that, but the work is more than just the wage. It's the social relationships that are built at work. It becomes, for many people, associated with their identity. And one of the things I think both presentations show is a shift now and a shift in the future of that social capital that is built up through work, and really opens up a question in the context of well-being, whether there's an emerging opportunity for community to play a greater role in creating that social connectivity that for the last 40, 60 years has really been the workplace. And is there something to build on there?
Yeah, no, that's great. You know, that's a bit of a segue. We have one question in the chat, and I don't know if I'm supposed to identify the person, but from Laura Muzikansky, who's asking us, I wonder if adopting wider metrics of well-being, such as Eisler's Social Wealth Index, to guided changing or promulgating specific policy might be an approach that would naturally allow to emerge interconnected and supportive policies that protect and increase well-being among workers and the entire population. So I don't know if anybody wants to take a stab at that, but I think, you know, the idea about picking up on some themes that have been articulated already about just changing how we conceive of some of these things. So I'm going to just throw it out there and see if anybody wants to pick up on that, or to use that as a way to introduce another thought about how we measure things, how we understand social well-being, social wealth in this case, but social well-being, to Bernie's last point. Have we got it wrong? I think you're suggesting that we're at a moment where we have to make some changes to our values. Dawn, you mentioned it in terms of hierarchy of wages. You know, I think Armine, you're pointing to it in terms of marginalized groups. What moment are we at, and what can it teach us? Go ahead, Armine.
So when I was brought into the DMO at ESTC, I was asked to help with their gender-based analysis in preparation for the budget. And most people don't know what GBA Plus can do or does do and doesn't do it. They don't do it very well. But while I was there, I watched the number of people that understood how you could actually do both. I mean, anything, TV subs, budgets, anything, and say, is what we're doing in government moving the needle for anybody? Right. And that's really what you're trying to do when you're doing GBA plus, gender-based analysis, and the plus is for all the intersectional groups. So we have got a lot of developing capacity in the public service to develop new indicators. Statistics Canada has been busting its butt to develop new indicators. Globally, this, because again, since 2010, all the mainstream economic institutions have been calling for inclusive growth. What does that mean? That means reducing inequality. And how do you know you're reducing inequality? You need new metrics. You know, CPI and unemployment rates don't cut it. We've been using monetary policy metrics to do fiscal policy and reducing inequality. It doesn't work. So you need other metrics, and we are getting quite good at doing that. But if you call it GBA plus, a conservative government that comes in is going to trash it. So actually what we're starting to talk about is not so much GBA plus metrics. And if you take a look at this year's budget, Annex 4 does exactly what, what Laura was talking about. It introduces all these new measures. Tiff Macklin, Governor of the Bank of Canada, Carolyn Wilkins and Steve Pullis before him, talking about how we need to look at, we need to lift the hood of aggregate measures and look at the distribution of those measures. We are in a new era. The question is, do we have similar measures to GDP that everybody agrees on? The answer is no. There's hundreds of measures, and you can cherry pick the measure you want to tell the story you want. But I think we are moving into an era of diversity and plurality of measures for tracking change. Whether you're in opposition or in government, you can make your point because there's plenty of data out there. And I think that's going to make things both more interesting and more difficult for governments to be able to have a plurality of measures that show citizens and taxpayers what they're getting from their elected representatives.
Yeah, oh, that's a great point. I'm going to see if Anke or Ada, Dawn, you want to jump in, go ahead.
I think we're at a beginning of a new era in public policy where this almost singular focus on gross domestic product or very aggregate measures of labor force will be replaced by a much broader set of metrics. I think we'll struggle for a while, particularly if we attempt to drive everything through a singular index, quality of life or whatever you want to cause, because as Armine was suggesting, we'll have endless debates of how you should weight it. You might weight the environment a certain weight and all weighted at a different weight and vice versa for other things. But I think we will agree if we look at the various different components. So we have this bizarre situation where health is always the number one interest and concern of people. It's probably the only area of public policy where we have no objectives. We have objectives for inputs, how much we spend. We relentlessly focus. We have objectives for wait times. We don't actually even frankly know the state of the health. We know the incidence of disease and illness and disability, but we don't know from a functional positive sense, and we definitely don't have any objectives for it. The environment's another aspect. I think we're getting that if you take $1 of a non-renewable resource out and that raises your GDP, you're not any better off if you've taken it onto one side of the balance sheet and it's off another. And if it creates an externality, you're worse off. We get that, and that's becoming more of a focal point of the quality. And we're getting to that if in the extreme, all of your gross domestic product increase came from benefits to 1% of the population, that really doesn't do very much. If your median doesn't go up, every low one goes up. So I think component by component, we are becoming more sophisticated. We'll struggle for a while to how to bring it into it. And we're struggling with the objectives. So it's coming back to health. Why don't we have an objective for health? Why don't we even measure of the health, and who's looking after that? And that's one of the difficulties with many of the policy areas are so fragmented. Nobody takes the lead on such important things.
Thank you. We have another question that I'm going to read, and I want to put it to Ada because I think it hits some of your proposal. It's from my colleague Alison McDermott at the Department of Finance. So I just want to acknowledge has been a driving force behind this quality of life work. So Alison She says, first of all, great panel. So kudos to everybody. And interested in thoughts on the role that technology and automation will play. And I'm just thinking about that, Ada, from your perspective in terms of looking at the labor force that you were looking at in your proposal. What is the role for government in this? And she has a separate question that might be more for the Canadians on the panel, like elaboration on a question of immigration, and particularly in relationship to low-wage temporary foreign workers. And I think, Armine, you covered some of this already. But maybe turn to Ada first, and just the role of technology and automation, because you were describing a situation where there's possibility for some regulation. You nuanced it, later on in some of your interventions. But, we're all kind of faced with the role of automation right now and technology by working at home. But what you're describing is a situation where that is kind of normal in terms of how they work. Is there something there in terms of that empowerment that you're trying to bring that has to have a dimension that pays attention to the role of technology and automation? Is there a role for government in that?
Well, there is some literature looking at the impact of automatization and digitalization. It's not very clear that the outcome is going to be less jobs, and for whom. It's not clear that low-educated individuals will, for example, have less jobs, right? And now we have seen with all the digitalization that actually gave a lot of jobs to many people. So the outcome of what's going to happen, it's not yet very well known. The only thing that automatization and digitalization may bring about also is that maybe some people will not have a job, no? So Don Drummond was talking a lot about liberalization and non-regulation. It's not that in favor of 100% regulation at all, but it is true that I think that there are some people that are more vulnerable and they will be more impacted by certain policies, like, for example, as we can see now. And not everybody has the choice. And if we get into a society in which we have people with a lot of choices and people with no choices and working and in access to jobs that are very poor quality, and Bernard was talking about social capital at work, and these gig workers don't have any social capital at work, not because they don't identify to their work. I'm not saying that some of them don't like it because it offers flexibility, they can study and work. So I'm not saying that all of them, but this is losing part of social capital. What you don't want is to get into a polarized society, right? You want to avoid a society in which some people are made redundant. Why are we talking a lot about minimum income? Because we are afraid that there is a part of the society that might become redundant, no? And we don't want that, because we want everybody to be able to work and to feel meaningful. If they don't want to work and it's they. And in that sense, we need to see what's going to happen with this. No, it brought more jobs now to certain people, so it's not true that it will it will deprive people from jobs. And just very short on what you were saying before, I think of course there are many measures that can be used, but I think that what is interesting about the whole well-being inputs, literature, etc., is not so much necessarily a metric to maximize something or improve something, like it can be the GDP, or it can be, inflation, unemployment, etc. It's not necessarily a single metric, but it's a way to also understand individuals' preferences, to understand what individuals want, what is important for individuals. You could say, well, what is important for individuals is what they choose. So if they work part-time, it's because they want to work part-time. Well, that would be true if, we will not face so many constraints, and we don't have equal opportunities. Markets don't always work perfectly. There is a lot of regulations. There is really a lot of regulations in place. So it's not true that there are no constraints. No? So it's a way to try to understand what preferences of individuals is, and try to aim at designing policies that may help to bring higher levels of satisfaction for people. Clearly, social capital is one. Also, a clear thing that seems to be more and more the case is that people would prefer a smaller growth. Let's forget about even the environment, but already from a well-being perspective, what we want is jobs for everybody. We want people able to work. We don't want a polarized society. We don't want to have a huge crisis. So we don't want to have important, the COVID we couldn't do anything about, right? But all the financial crisis we have had, that brings a lot of misery, a lot of unemployment, and it's very difficult to recover from this unhappiness. So it's maybe better to have a more post-growth, like the paper by the NEF. If anyone is interested, I can send the reference. Sorry I took so long.
No, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to pick up on your point about metrics and measures and turn to a question from Yannick Baudouin, who's asking, is there a risk that existing alternative metrics remain predominantly informed by the same worldview that created the current problematic reality? So, second part, how might a culturally informed worldview get us to something different with regards to reimagining the terms or transforming the terms that we use? So we're still using terms like, of course, labor, workers. Might we talk instead about people and persons, and so not kind of creating a divide between our day life, which is our jobs, but now, as many of you noted, extended into our person or people life, supposedly outside of work. But I don't know, Yannick, if you thought it would be more organic or not, but I think that's a legitimate question. Maybe our starting point even needs to be re-examined. Anyone want to take that on? Okay, Dawn, over to you.
I can definitely see that concern if one wants to talk about stereotypes. Let's suppose that civil servants or academics stayed stuck in their offices and decided from those office confines to redefine the metrics. We'd probably end up with something very stagnant and not terribly different we got right now. But such as it is, whether you call it the economics of happiness or this movement of well-being, tends to be based on the view of the people. They actually ask people what they want. And they ask people what makes them happy and what makes them unhappy. And the metrics are to design that. If I come back, sorry to be the broken record, but if we look at health, you ask people to self-assess the health. And if you're asking them if they think in good health, you ask them, what is the functional element of what allows you to say you're in good health? Or if you think you're in bad health, you don't ask them to list off that I have this or I have that ailment. You say, what are you prevented from doing that would make you unhealthy? It's very important to do that. But I would say, to the credit of this movement, if we can call it, it does ask those questions about people. And that's why you get things that wouldn't necessarily be on that bureaucrats or academics' mind if they just stayed in their office, like trust in fellow citizens, trust in government looms so high in these valuations, and a lot of positive things flow from them. It's a little bit difficult. Again, coming back, there's no single lever you can pull to influence that. Again, it comes back to these more deep-rooted culture aspects, but I'm not that worried about that because I see this broader people-based approach being taken.
Anke, what do you think about that? Because you work in the area of norms and you talked about culture in your presentation and changing culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Dawn just said, when we use actually subjective well-being measures, that's exactly that. People can evaluate which aspects of their lives are important to them. So in the UK, we have the Office of National Statistics, the ONS, and they actually now have 4 measures that they ask and regularly. And one of them is also about eudaimonic well-being, so whether you live a life that is worthwhile. So I think we see the approach definitely in some countries now coming more and more with these subjective well-being measures, and that's what you're getting at. So I was also thinking when the question came up about if we just look at things like GDP, unemployment, in times of a pandemic, we would neglect completely things like, well, what about people who, for example, kept their jobs, and then just looking at, well, are they employed or not? We would think, yes, they must be still well off, but we know, looking at gender again, that for a lot of parents, homeschooling, lack of childcare was usually problematic. So yes, they might look good on papers in terms of they didn't lose their jobs and they still are financially fine. But of course, a lot of other areas of their lives were not okay. So then looking at something like life satisfaction, relationship satisfaction, job satisfaction will actually give us more of an overall picture how they're doing. So yes, absolutely hugely important.
Great. I'm going to go back to the second part of Alison McDermott's question and maybe turn to you, Armine. Just what she was asking is just a bit more elaboration on the question of immigration. I believe you had raised that in the context of just our labor market, but also newcomers and vulnerabilities that they face. And so in particular, she's interested in some thoughts on low-wage temporary foreign workers. So I think it marries up a couple of points that people have made. I mean, we know wage, like we still need to talk about labor and workers, and we know that a wage is fundamental to well-being. But thoughts on just, given our continuing dependence on immigration, do we have that right? And what could we do?
Well,
they tend to be marginalized, yeah.
It's very difficult for the federal government to get this one right because federal departments stick in their own lanes, and this requires two departments, immigration and human resources, employment and social development now, to row in the same direction, and they're not. To Don's point, we're not seeing large-scale labor shortages now. No, we're in the middle of a pandemic. But even now, we're hearing people saying, "I can't find somebody to do the job at, $14 an hour." And it's even more accentuated in the United States, where the job recovery isn't as strong as it is here. And so I think we know that in the run-up to the pandemic, on both sides of the border, we were seeing every month with the labor force survey prints and the Bureau of Labor Statistics prints, historically low unemployment rates that we haven't seen for 40, 45 years. The pandemic poured accelerant on that phenomenon, which was population aging, which is mathematical. More exits from the labor market than entrance to it. The pandemic actually increased both of those things. More exits of people over the age of 55, fewer people between 15 and 24 coming in. And that is what the future looks like. Yeah. So we know it's going to be widespread. We know in areas that we're already dealing with depopulation because of population aging, it's going to get harder to find people to do the basic services. And even in big cities, as Don was raising with personal care workers in long-term care, we don't have enough people to do these things. And we don't certainly, to the point that we're not just workers. The biggest schism in each of us individually, I'm not answering Allison's point very, very much, but I do want to come back to how do we self-define? Mm-hmm. We are pitting ourselves often we pit ourselves as consumers against ourselves as workers, because nobody wants to pay more than they have to for anything. But if the Zeller's principle, is the prevailing wisdom, the lowest price is the law, is the prevailing wisdom, you're pitting yourself for a cheap price against what kind of work is available. So I think we've got some really profound questions to ask about the value of work for low-wage workers, and then how we bring in newcomers and how we treat them when we bring them in. And are we even offering the same opportunities to our own youth? For example, there are all these tax reductions for companies that have to go overseas to recruit, to provide the mobility, to bring in temporary foreign workers. We don't offer that to our young people. For people under the age of 30, we could have a mobility program to encourage people to move someplace else. Mm-hmm. Or we could have more return of service deals for more training. We know we are going to be running out of healthcare workers. 50% of registered nurses, 50% of doctors are over the age of 55. 45% of nurses are over the age of 45. We just burned a whole bunch of them out too. Yeah. Do we have a plan for replenishing this stock of healthcare workers? No, we do not. It is not national. It is not provincial. It doesn't exist. It is a way of action. We should be making it very low cost to be a care worker, mm-hmm. in all the versions of care, and helping people move to the places where these people are needed. But we don't have that plan in place. So instead, we're going to import the solution, as we have for the last 25 years. So there is a real issue here about how we value people. And to Don's point earlier, we have gone through the looking glass. The combination of the global financial crisis and the pandemic has meant that we realized focusing government priorities on growing GDP doesn't deliver the goods, doesn't deliver the good to too many people. It can't work if the only people that are winning are the top 1%. If that's everything that government is focused on is boost GDP, lower spending. We are now through the looking glass where we see that well-being is a huge part of what governments are there to do, to provide. In New Zealand, we are about to have the third well budget, which is it's a reframing of what budgets are for. And it doesn't use categorically new measures, but to Dawn's point, it focuses on people over money. And that's the moment we are going in after 40 years of chasing dollars, making sure that we are bringing in more foreign direct investment, that we are goosing productivity and investment. After 40 years of focusing on how to grow the GDP pie, we are shifting to how do we become people magnets? Because we're going to need everybody. We're going to need all hands on deck in the coming years. So we are shifting from dollars to people, and it will be a bumpy ride in the next little while, I guarantee it.
For sure. And I think like this really your comment takes us full circle back to the policy ideas from Anke and Ada, just like that those were exactly directed in part at that question. So I'm going to open it up, Dawn, and go ahead.
I just want to pick up on two things that Armine said. The first one, do we have a plan to deal with our present and future needs for medical professionals, doctors and nurses? Well, actually, we've had a plan. In the 1990s was actually to get rid of doctors and nurses. We were almost celebrating at the time, particularly when nurses got raided off to the United States. Somehow we thought that was a great idea. That didn't turn out so well. And that's been replaced by a plan that's a little bit more benevolent, but it is tightly restrict the entry. And in certain medical professions, it is virtually impossible to get into a program. That is the plan. You should not like it, but there actually is a plan. It's a bizarre plan. Totally unmatched the needs. We actually train more people in pediatrics than we do in gerontology. We have the stream into Ontario in gerontology was a handful of people in the last couple of years, and they have more medical hours of training in pediatrics and gerontology. So that's really just absolutely bonkers. The second thing I wanted to pick up, she was saying, and the thing I hear an awful lot, I can't find the labor at $14 an hour. I wanted to focus on the second half of the sentence because that's the flexibility I'm talking about. Yeah, you can't, because you can't make a decent living and yourself, never mind your family, at $14 an hour. Why is that taken as a given? Because it's had an historical base, because maybe these jobs don't have a bachelor's or master's degree and you have to make lower than that. But if that's the demand and we need that, then why it has to be so inflexible? I was speaking fairly recently to the Ontario Truckers Association. All they wanted to talk about is the shortage of workers. Are there women in Ontario trucking? No. Are they tapping in wholeheartedly into recent immigrant community? No. It's a rough, tough, brutal job. You're sitting there all the time. It's stressful. Are there thoughts of changing the nature of the job? Well, no, because that would cost more. And then you would have to pass that on and we'd have to pay more for our goods. Well, that's what we're going to have to do. That's part of that flexibility. We need to change.
No. Anyone want to jump in on that? How are we going to change? Any thoughts, Bernie? What would you do from a Nova Scotia perspective?
Well, this would be more from a national perspective. Okay. When we do look at happiness, I'll kind of play up the East. People get less happy from East to West in Canada, and we've always lower GDP growth. So that is good evidence of the delinking of GDP and happiness. And even within Nova Scotia, our happiest county happens to be the lowest income county and the highest unemployment county. So it is important to conceptualize this as being not a given that GDP leads to happiness. That's the blinding glimpse of the obvious. But Yannick had a good question, I thought. And can we get there with the worldview that we brought into the global financial crisis and into the pandemic? And I think the answer is no. These are not changes that occur at the margin. We can't keep the systems exactly as they are and just add on to them. These are changes at the center, and the political process informs the public policy process. And to add as a presentation, and this is the aspect where I very much be fully aligned. The voice needs to be given to the people, and it needs to be reacted to at the political process and converted into policy. So New Zealand's a good example. Scotland's also a good example. But I think Canada and Nova Scotia, for that matter, is also an area where we can not follow, but we can lead. We need to expect more from the political process and the public policy process. But part of that is, how do we measure? And you know, if we're measured, and politicians ultimately know they're being measured by the well-being outcomes, is the independent worker happier? They may not, there may be a whole range of reasons they select into that, but is the public policy process supporting their happiness? Then that is success, rather than GDP growth, which historically been the measure. You know, balanced budget, GDP growth, people should be happy. Well, they're not. So I think, to Yannick's point, this is really foundational and fundamental. I think Nova Scotia is doing a lot of things well right now. Danny Graham opened up the conference with a presentation from Engaged Nova Scotia, and we've got a lot of data. And it's really, how does that then influence the political process and ultimately the public policy process?
No, that's great. And maybe I want to circle back to our presenters kind of on that point. And let me start with Ada. So we've been talking about Canada. We've had some comparisons with other countries, but of course you can bring us a comparison from Spain too. And just wondering, when you were developing your idea, what were you thinking about in the Spanish context, if anything? Like, we know, precarious work there, it is very much part of the economic situation, particularly since the crisis in 2008, 2009 really a challenge in terms of getting the Spanish economy back on track. I think it's still, probably varies regionally, but it's a national issue. Would something like you proposed be politically feasible in Spain? Is it being contemplated at all?
Thank you. Well, what it's being contemplated actually is a 32 hours week rather than the underrepresented workers. Right. So we can talk about this later. I did have in mind, of course, Spain, because we all bring our own baggage. I tried to do as much search as possible at Canada, and I have to say I was very much impressed about all the policies. No, Armine was mentioning them already, about all these policies in which you include a lot of workers into the policy arena and discussing with them. So I congratulate your country for this. In the case of Spain, we have a bit the situation that I was also mentioning before, but in the extreme case, no? So we have an over-regulated labor market on one side, and then a lot of unprotected workers on the other side. So on one side, we have a huge unemployment rates, as you know. Even when we are in a moment of economic growth, unemployment is already quite high in Spain. So our good unemployment rate can be 8 or 9%, and then we can move to 20%. But young people, for example, is 50%. So sometimes the unemployment rate can get as high as to 50% of the young people. No, and this is part of the same thing that we are seeing with what I was saying with the gig workers and things like this, right? So you have one market that is very much regulated, the insiders. So those people that already have a job, they have a permanent contract, their job is protected. It's quite expensive to fire these people, even if they are not productive. It's cheaper sometimes to keep them than to fire them. Of course, not in the long term, but people tend to think in the short and medium term. And on the other side, you have people that are outsiders. They are not unionized, either because they are gig economy or because they are temporary workers, or also because they are very young people that are very depoliticized. It's also a choice. Unemployed are also badly represented. So when I think about underrepresented, I could take a lot of people in the labor market that are not represented, people in sick leaves, people that are unemployed, no? Young people, people in temporary work are not represented. For these people, flexibilization of the labor market would be much better. Single contract, you get someone, if it's not good enough, you can fire them, for example. That would reduce unemployment and would not polarize the market, no? So indeed, I was very much inspired by and of course some recent movies on gig workers and the commentaries.
Thanks very much for that. And Anke, in terms of your, so, you are German, married to a French person, but living in the UK. So you've got like multiple perspectives. But what are you seeing in terms of current policy in the UK? And I don't know, sorry, if your research is based particularly on the UK population or it's a bit more broad in terms of the European context, but are you hopeful in terms of what you're seeing in terms of public policy in the UK or maybe more broadly in the EU?
I think the UK is very good at measuring well-being. Ada will probably agree with me. Actually, a lot of researchers in our area, we use British data and German data because these are the two countries that have fantastic longitudinal data. And as I already mentioned, the ONS is also now collecting for well-being measures regularly. So I think the UK and some other European countries are very good at measuring well-being. Is it being implemented? That's another question, which is a lot more difficult to answer. In my area where I look at well-being and gender equality, I would say some other countries are maybe better in doing better in terms of things like maternity leave provision, parental leave provision, and so on. But I think what's definitely nice here is to see that things are being measured, so it actually allows researchers like Ada and me to look at well-being in a population and hopefully do some good research that will then inform policymakers. Yeah.
No, data is key for sure. And as Armine noted from her experience inside government, like there is a lot of data, and I think there is a lot of momentum as well. But then I think the challenge, speaking as a policymaker, is the choices, and then of course responding to different pressures from the population. And that's why I find this idea so interesting, right? It's like, when do you get that pressure, and when do people mobilize? And so I'm going to turn to, I don't know who had their hand up first, but let me go to, was it Ada and then Armine? Okay, go ahead.
But if there are other questions, that's okay. Yeah? But I had a question for Anke actually. So I don't know if there are more questions from the public.
So go ahead. Why don't you ask her?
No, because one of the things that worry me the most and is this polarization that, automatization may bring about, and all these unrepresented immigrants, etc., all this type of things. That worries me a lot. And I'm also worried that, if you polarize the society, that can generate a lot of tension, and where losers and winners get into the extreme, right? Then when she was mentioning the 32 hours in Spain, now they are going to do a trial for 3 years for 50 million euros. They are going to put into it, and it's going to be voluntary. Now, it's clear from experiments, right, that it increases productivity, what Bernard was also telling about his own experience. What worries me is if this is going to be generalized, will this not even increase more inequalities? Because I was thinking, that on one side, you have industries in which it cannot be applied. That's the first thing. And then on the other side, some of us are basically workaholics and we work 80 hours a week. And I put myself here, I'm not proud of it. But, and then we will continue working 80 hours. I don't care if it's 32 hours, which means that, the distance will increase in our society. And that's a bit my concern for the future. Many of you were mentioning a lot of things, but what worries me at this moment the most is the polarization of society. The fact also that we live in a fairly geographically mobile society. So we marry with people that are like that, and this is increasingly so. So people people used to marry with people that were living next to them, and now we look people that have the same level of skills than us in the other side of the wall, as Anke is doing, and that's making worse and worse this kind of polarization, and that's what worries me. And in this policy would be, I like the policy, but that would be my only concern.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I think it's always kind of funny that a lot of the people that I know that work on proposals like this, they have 38-hour contracts, but they work a lot more hours. So they're not doing it themselves, right? So how can you expect anyone else to do it? But still, there needs to be a start somewhere, and slowly things can become norms. And I think actually now the pandemic is a huge opportunity, because 2 years ago, we did not think that many people would want to work from home. And now a lot of people are demanding it. It used to be, women wanted to work from home to pick up the kids from school. Now a lot of men also want to work from home. So changes are possible, right? And so maybe the pandemic is actually an opportunity for this, to say, yes, let's try to have this radical cultural change. So there, as you mentioned, Spain, I also read about Spain was publicized in The Guardian here that they're doing this trial, which seems to be quite modest, but it's great to have a trial like this. But also companies are doing implementing 4-day weeks, or sometimes it's not necessarily a 4-day week, but it's more like work 6 hours over 5 days. So different variations of this. Companies are implementing it. Some large companies, it's also was mentioned here before by Armine. And so these changes are maybe slowly happening. But I think if employers see that it's also coming from the upper management levels, so it's just not, women taking advantage of this because they want to pick up the kids from school, but also managers are actually living this and doing it, and also showing that, yes, it's important for them to get deep rest, that it's good for their creativity, that, yes, you should put your life on your to-do list. I like this motto. Yeah. Fantastic. Then slowly can trickle down and then basically show, the next generation, well, this is what management level is doing, so you can also do it. And I think actually you see a bit of a generational shift where it is shifting, because now fathers also want to, not just be the breadwinner, but also be more involved with children. And maybe through the pandemic also, they were kind of forced more into this role of homeschooling and being home, and now start demanding it. And so I think the shift is possible. Yes. Will it affect everyone and be evenly spread? No, probably not, but we have to start somewhere.
And on that, just before I turn to Armine, we had a question from Brian Smile. I'm sorry, Brian, if I didn't get your name right, but he kind of picks up on the last point you were making, Anke. So Brian, I think, your point about we've done some things in the last federal budget about quality of life and kind of trying to embed that framework, but how can we ensure that momentum is maintained, even if we had a change in government? And I think Anke answered that in part, like it's going to be those changes in norms that happen too, and that, if the democratic process works, that those demands get made of governments, no matter what the political stripe. But I think too, we're sort of still in the middle of the pandemic and not really able to assess fully what the changes will be in the longer term. But I think there's some hopeful signs from what we've heard. Armine, I think you wanted to come in earlier.
Well, maybe I'll use this opportunity as my wrap-up comment, which is that not only does the democratic process prevail throughout different changes of government, so does the demographic process. That aging populations are going to create new pressures on governments to show that they're not wasting money, because the boomers are going to expect the same services they've had their entire life, but they don't want to pay more. And there's going to be a shrinking cohort of working age people who are going to be asked to be propping up everybody that is too old, too young, and too sick to work. So governments are going to have to show that they're putting public finances to best use. Opportunity cost is going to become a new form of metric. We do have all this data, Siobhan, and we also have evaluation mechanisms that we have not publicized that the best use of dollars are. And I think that's going to be one of the new normals in fiscal policy, to show to taxpayers, well, we have $100 million. We can spend it this way, or this way. It's the same $100 million you pick. Here's the different things we get. Here's how much we move the needle on this, and that. I think it's a whole new conversation. I think we've established many different ways in this conversation, how we've gone through the looking glass and what we're doing and why we're doing it and who we're doing it for. And those conversations are not going to change. When I say demographics, I don't just mean the boomers swamping every single conversation about public policy and taxation. I mean fertility. So to Anke's point about the next generation of new parents, I think that's where the demand to be able to step away from paid work, to be able to care for a new life that comes into your household, is going to be the way you're going to build new norms and momentum that demands that people get treated as humans first and workers second by their governments. And I think that's when we talk about broadening access to parental leave for everybody in Canada who is not just EI eligible, that's how we start changing that conversation in a meaningful way that everybody can see, grandparents can see, bosses can see, and the people that are thinking about having kids. Our fertility rates are below replacement rates right now. Yeah. It's the same throughout the global north. We think we can import anybody we want. We won't be able to. We will be competing with every other global north country for people that may or may not want to come and live in Canada, given our weather, given our politics. And so consequently, we're going to have to do better by the people that we have. And starting with young families is, I think, the appropriate place to change norms. And I appreciate Anke's work in that regard. But I also love Ada's work, because I think the next generation, whom we're not measuring very well, how they're integrating into the labor market, is going to have a hell of a time getting into the labor market. And part of it will be through gig work, because it's just a foothold in the door, and they are not protected as workers. Yeah. They're treated as the self-employed. They don't get labor protection. So it's ripe for exploitation, and we can't do that. We cannot treat workers like that anymore. Flexibility, yes, but not just for the employers.
So that's a great, I'm going to pick up on your last part and just acknowledge a question from Jessie Gao, who said that it's flexibility, yes, but we also have to talk about the quality of our jobs. And I think, that's a reflection of what you said, but also of Ada's presentation, and that we will get kind of satisfaction and well-being from, the opportunities that we get in the workplace, like job security, job fit, opportunities for promotion. And Jessie, I know you were asking for further insights on that, but I think that you just got some from Armine, and I think that we would all agree with your position. It's like trying to bring these two things together in a work-life balance, or in some sort of framework where we're acknowledged as people and workers, and especially in these times when that distinction has been very blurred for us, and we're living the consequences on a daily basis, but some people more acutely than others. I think, Chris, I don't know if I have time to turn to Bernie and Dawn for some parting thoughts. If you don't say no, I'll open the mic.
We are now 2 minutes over time for closing, and we have to prep for the next session.
Okay. Well, it was obviously a very stimulating session. I'm sure everyone will agree. And I just, for my part, before I hand it back to Chris, just want to thank the audience, but as well thank the ideas from Ada and Anke. They were obviously, great stimulators in terms of the conversation that followed, and to thank Armine, Bernie, and Dawn for their comments. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was riveting, and I have to say that we've been incredibly fortunate to assemble such a distinguished panel. So thank you very much for your time and your thoughts on this. This will be very important for the flow of the rest of the conference. As you know, the next week in the private session, we'll be leveraging what happened today, and that will come together after that. So, and special thank you to Siobhan Harty for moderating our discussion. So we're about to close this room, and we'll come back in less than 10 minutes now for the next sessions. So everybody, please take a quick bio break and return for that. You'll have if you can return, you'll have a choice to hear about some very curious and exciting policies related to income and consumption, or urban life and community. And we have 2 more sets of truly brilliant panelists. And otherwise, please notice that there are places to continue the discussion online in the conference platform. And if you click on Q&A, you'll find questions and answers also from our opening panel last week, as well as from today's. So if you're leaving us here, thank you for attending. Be good, take care of each other, and please do not even think about missing our closing 2-hour session on Friday, May 28th. Thank you all.